We are going live now. In a few minutes, I will see myself. Yes, we are live. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone, for your presence today. Today we have a special Eurosci Network discussion in which we will discuss about the result of the presidential election in the United States, and in particular, its influence for the UK, Ireland, the EU, and Brexit. And we have today with us a very special guest, who is Professor Christian Kaunert from the University of South Wales in the UK. Welcome, Christian.
Hi, Diego. Great to be there with you.
Okay, the people who are watching us now on YouTube, they can write on the chat and please tell us about the sound. We are making an experiment with the sound, so please give us some feedback about the sound. If there's some echo when Professor Kaunert speaks. So, Professor Kaunert, I will start with the first question. Who do you think will be the next president in the United States?
I think the election result has been quite conclusive. I think President-elect Joe Biden won the popular vote by 5 million votes, and it looks like he's on course to have an electoral majority that is very significant, something like 306 votes, which would be in the region of 36 more votes than he actually needs to become president. So I think it is looking very good that we will have President-elect Biden, and in fact he's already forming his transition team. So I think with a very high degree of confidence that we can say that it will be Joe Biden, the next president of the United States.
Okay, so yes, that was a warm-up question. It was not a very controversial question, although maybe in some media it can still be controversial, but I think it's less and less controversial. So let's suppose that Joe Biden will be the next president of the United States. Do you think this will change the relation between the European Union and the United States at all?
I think it will have a very clear impact on the relationship between Europe and the United States. I mean, if we just look back last 4 years under President Donald Trump, what we found was that increasingly there's been a sense of alienation between the United States of America and between the European Union, or Europe as a whole, largely.
There is some noise now. I don't know. Are you receiving messages or am I receiving messages?
No, I receive emails. That unfortunately I cannot stop that.
Is it on the computer, right? Yeah. Okay, I didn't know if it was on my side. That's no problem.
Yeah, so I think it will have a very significant impact. We could see that over the last 4 years, there's been a sense of deep alienation. In fact, I mean, of course, President Trump has been a relatively protectionist president. We saw that in his relation with China and in his relation with other countries. But I think in particular, we saw that in relation with Europe. His specific target has often been Brussels, but even more often, his target has been Germany. The kind of relationship that he's had with Germany has been particularly controversial and particularly conflictuous. So I think as a result of that, we will see a very significant change. I mean, one of the last things that President Trump was doing was to relocate a significant number of American soldiers away from Germany into Poland. That is what the plans have been as of more recently. And I think what we will see is that probably President-elect Biden is going to reverse some of those decisions. He is likely to at least scale down the element of moving military away from Germany, because of course this is widely seen as a bonus to Russia. It was in fact something like a little present to President Putin, and the relationship will significantly improve. We have already seen that that the Europeans have been obviously very, very happy about Joe Biden becoming president. This was to be expected, but I think in geopolitical terms, this is really going to make a significant difference. Now, that's not to say that there won't be any friction in a transatlantic relationship. There always has been, there always will be. If we go back to President Obama or President George W. Bush, we continuously had frictions in the relationship, but I think the problem was in particular related, of course, to NATO. That the fear has been that if President Trump gets a second term, that he would actually dismantle NATO, that there wouldn't be a new system to replace it with. And of course, the Europeans are not ready to protect themselves without the help of America yet. And I think in that sense, the Europeans just gained another 4 years to develop their capabilities and to be able to really significantly advance, because for now Joe Biden is elected.
So the question, if the relations with Europe will change, and you say that you believe so, in a sense that they will improve in the relations with Germany. How about the relations with other European superpowers such as France or the UK?
Yes, I think for France, we can already see that it's very likely that France is going to become a particular central point, actually, for the new US president. It is to be expected that President Macron and President Joe Biden are going to have quite a close relationship. And I think they're going to try and work very hard to rescue the transatlantic security relationship in terms of NATO, trying to bring out the European element much, much more clearly. So I think there's likely to be a very close relationship. Now, with Prime Minister Johnson and the United Kingdom, it will be an interesting story here, because on the one hand, of course, Boris Johnson had a very close personal relationship with President Trump, which would lead you to think that he's at a certain disadvantage to have a very equally close relationship with President Biden. Also, there have been a number of stories in the press reporting about how, you remember at the time when President Obama was still in the White House, he removed the statue of Winston Churchill. There were certain comments that were made at the time by Boris Johnson, who at the time was not yet prime minister, that was seen as slightly racist on the side of Obama. And of course, the press reporting in the UK has been such that there's a suggestion that there could be suffering of relationship between the UK and the United States. I wouldn't go quite as far, because of course the United Kingdom is always going to be very important for the United States, just like the United States is the most important relationship for the United Kingdom. So I think systemically this will not change. Systemically, the relationship between the UK and the United States is always going to be very close. But in terms of the big difference will be the tone will be quite different. And I think the biggest impact that we're going to see in the short term is that, of course, President-elect Biden is not a big fan of Brexit. And I think here we will see a certain cautiousness that Prime Minister Boris Johnson is going to pursue. So I think we will see a sense of cautiousness in terms of making a deal with the European Union. And as a result of that, this is where the biggest impact will be in the short term. I think in the long term, the relationship is on solid ground, so I don't think there's going to be anything to fear for neither the UK.
So I'm not so sure about that, because it's true that Boris Johnson has had a good relation with Donald Trump, but on the other hand, Boris Johnson is quite, let's say, a professional politician that has good relations with everyone. And also another point is that it's true that Boris Johnson comes from the Conservative Party and that Joe Biden now comes from the Democrats. But I believe that the American Democrats are closer probably to the UK Conservatives in terms of policy. for instance, it was discussed about the NHS, in the negotiations between the UK and the US for a future trade deal with the US, and the NHS was a point of friction. I believe that with Joe Biden, this will not be such a friction, probably because it's closer to the conservatives in this respect. So I mean that it's not the same in the US to be a northern Democrat or a southern Democrat, and it's not the same to be an American conservative or a British conservative. I don't think that Johnson will have any ideological problems with Joe Biden. And we know Johnson also changed his mind very, very often in the past about many issues, including Brexit. And I think he will have enough flexibility to deal with the new president of the US. My next question is about relations between the UK and the EU. How do you think this new presidency may affect those relations?
I think what we're going to see is a, relatively speaking, closer relationship between the UK and the European Union than what might have happened had there been a second term by President Trump. I think pragmatically, like you just said, Prime Minister Johnson, he's very flexible, and he can do U-turns, he can do different pirouettes, he can flexibly move in such a way, and I think he's likely to be doing that, because one of the biggest things that the Democrats and of course Joe Biden have made it very clear is Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland. And I think in order to maintain the Good Friday Agreement and peace in Northern Ireland, a relative degree of closeness between the EU and the UK is necessary. And I think Boris Johnson is going to go down that route. I think we're going to see quite a lot of flexibility on the UK side in the next week or two in terms of making a deal with the European Union. And I believe we're going to have a deal in the next 2 weeks.
Do you think that this election result has weakened the negotiating position of the UK government in this trade deal negotiation with the EU?
No, I don't think it has really significantly changed the position, but not in terms of weakness or power, but it has changed the outlook in terms of where the UK will be heading, because of course under President Trump there could have been an attempt to replace the EU with a US deal. It is debatable whether Trump would have gotten such a deal through the Senate anyway, and in fact it could be argued that a Democrat president might actually find that easier to achieve such a deal. But I think the idea that you can do without the EU, that idea has kind of reduced in salience and importance on the British side. I think that is very clear. And that's why I believe we're going to have a deal between the UK and the EU in the next 2 weeks.
So you don't think that the result of the election means that Brexit can be reversed?
No. But I don't think anybody at this point can reverse it, because Brexit has legally occurred, Brexit has happened on the 1st of January of last year. On the 30th of January, 31st of January this year. And as a result of that, it has legally already happened. It has happened. And in fact, even an extension of the transition period is legally no longer possible, because the transition period very clearly stated, the withdrawal agreement, that, if not by this summer there had been a request to extend the transition period, this would no longer be possible. So I don't think we can extend the transition period, which means that whatever we will see on the 1st of January of next year will be the new relationship between the UK and the EU. And Brexit will not be reversed. I don't think in the near future this is on the cards. But I think the relationship between the two will not be as distant as what otherwise might have been possible.
Okay, another related thing is that if Brexit will not be reversed, the UK will need to have new trade agreements with many nations in the world, and in particular with the US. The new presidency do you think this will affect the new trade deal that the UK will get with the US? Will there be a change of focus, or it will be the same as they would have got with Donald Trump as president?
I think in a number of ways it could be a better deal that they can get with Joe Biden over the deal that they might have had with Donald Trump. Because, of course, with Donald Trump, while he was very supportive of a hard Brexit, he would have been equally supportive of using that position of strength towards the UK to get a very, very good deal for the United States and not so good for the United Kingdom. So I think in that sense, the deal that the UK can have with the US under President Joe Biden is likely to be a better deal than what might have actually happened with President Trump. But the slight issue could be one of timing. It could be that President Biden might prioritize having maybe a deal with the EU over the UK. This is, if you remember, in the Brexit referendum, this is what President Obama at the time said, that if the UK leaves the EU, it might be at the back of the queue. Now, will it be at the total back of the queue? Certainly not. But what that could be an indication of is that the US side might prioritize a deal with the EU if they think a deal can be done. If they think an actual deal can be done on the European side, if the EU is ready to do a deal and they're ready to do one quickly, he might decide to prioritize a deal with the EU. If they calculate that the EU is not ready for such a deal, then I think he will go ahead with the UK deal first.
Do you think that it's possible that the deal that the US will sign with the EU will be linked to the deal they will offer to the UK in order not to threaten the internal market? And for instance, you mentioned the Good Friday Agreement in Ireland, and this idea of breaking up the European single market. But if they offer the same deal to the EU and the UK, then this wouldn't be a problem.
Yeah. I think those two deals are probably going to be relatively similar. Of course, in the EU, it's a little bit more complicated because you have 27 countries that are wanting slightly different things. So in that sense, the EU's position is not going to be as coherent as we might find with the UK position. But you might find that the deals are not going to be a million miles away from each other. If you look at the deals that the UK has already made since leaving the EU, for instance, with Japan, they are remarkably similar with the deal that Japan already had with the EU. So on none of the important criteria for the UK is that deal very different. So I think something similar might happen with the US.
Okay. So one of you mentioned that every country has its own interests, and in the case of the EU about trade, the EU is accused very often about with protectionism, in particular for agriculture. In the recent deal with Mercosur, the opponents of the deal were mainly France, who supported the domestic sugar beet production, and Ireland, who supported Irish beef from Argentinian imports. And Donald Trump has been very supportive of the farming industry in the US, the farming sector, and also in trade deals with China, and probably would do the same with the EU. But maybe with the election of Biden as president, this could change, and maybe the US administration would not be so interested in pressing for the exports of, let's say, genetically modified corn or chlorinated chicken. These are like the stereotypes, that are mentioned very often, but in fact it's agricultural products. And do you think that this will change with Biden as president?
I think there will certainly be a change, because just if we look in terms of electoral votes, where do those two candidates get their votes from? Obviously, the kind of US farming community was much, much more strongly behind President Trump. So it's only natural that he would have supported them more strongly than maybe President-elect Biden will. So we will see possibly a slight change in US position here, which I think could actually make a deal with the EU more possible, because like you say, on both sides there's strong sections of protectionism, and if they're both in the same area, like in agriculture, maybe you can just take agriculture out of that deal or keep it slightly separate, and then you can do a deal on the rest, which could actually mean that a deal might be more possible in terms of the EU and the United States. So I think here this tonal difference and this slight difference of emphasis could really make a big difference. The important point, though, is we shouldn't forget that even if a deal is done, it needs to go through the Senate, and it needs to be ratified in the Senate. And of course, Joe Biden cannot go too far, because the Senate will, in all likelihood, still have a Republican majority. I think that is relatively clear. There's a slim chance that there could be a Democrat majority, but it's not a very big chance. It rests on basically 2 Senate seats in Georgia. So I think it's unlikely that we're going to see President-elect Biden making too large concessions in agriculture, because he needs to then still get the deal also through the Senate.
Yes, but that would favor the status quo. It would make any changes more difficult, but it would favor the status quo. But my next question, you say that probably there will be less friction on agriculture, but of course Biden has already been elected on a ticket also that has been supported by, let's say, the artists in Hollywood, or the high-tech companies such as Google, Facebook, Twitter, Apple, and so on and so forth. And it appears even like more recently, probably also the pharmaceutical companies, because it's a strange coincidence that they announced the promising results of the vaccine just a few days after the election. So my question is that if the friction could come in those areas in which the European Union also has frictions traditionally with the US, such as with the what's it called? GDPR?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the general data protection regulations, for those who are watching, that affect very much these high-tech American industries that are based on big data, and they're based on personal data and artificial intelligence and so on. The question is that if the friction will not be agriculture now, will that friction be now in these sectors, in intellectual property, in data protection and so on?
Yes, I think certainly there will be more friction in those areas, and you're absolutely right to say that. Obviously, those areas supported President-elect Biden, so they're going to want something in return. But my impression is that these areas are not as important in terms of EU industry itself, in terms of political weight that they will have on the EU's position overall. So I think on this particular point, there might be more friction, but the US is more likely to get their way, because it matters less to the European Union, I think, than agriculture, which is, in France or in Ireland, is a very, very important political subject, and that gets a lot of votes. So I think because of that, even though there could be frictions, and even those frictions could be increased, the political weight of those frictions might be less.
Another related question is that now, with the current pandemic and the associated economic crisis, European governments are undergoing heavy public deficits and are in need now of more revenue, more resources. And one possible source of funding has been mentioned very often as the so-called Google tax. The tax on those companies who operate in Europe and by using personal data of people, but they do not pay many taxes in those countries in which they operate. Some of those taxes they pay them in Ireland, and other taxes they do not pay them at all in the EU. So my question is that if you think that the election of Joe Biden as the next president of the US can affect negatively the prospects of a Google tax for the EU?
I think that's a very difficult one. I mean, it's entirely possible that, one needs to start by saying that there's two different geopolitical developments. On the one hand, it's always been difficult to do tax harmonization in the EU. And of course, countries like Ireland have traditionally always opposed that. And I think they're going to continue opposing that because it's important for the economic model. But the second point is that, of course, with the pandemic and the huge amount of EU funding that is necessary to kickstart the EU economy because of the pandemic, there will be a need for future revenue sources. So I think there could be an attempt being made to go down that route again. So I think this is definitely a possibility that in relations with the United States, this could become a friction point. There's no doubt about that. But whether it will be something that can actually be agreed on, I'm still doubtful, because when it comes to tax, we need unanimity. And as a result of that, if it becomes, a core feature of a state's interest, they're unlikely to just let go of that very easily. So I think I'm still a little bit skeptical whether that is something quite easy to introduce in the EU.
Okay, let's now move on to the final topic in this discussion, is security and defense. And my question relates to the United States policy in the neighborhood of the European Union, in particular in Ukraine, in a country where Joe Biden has great relations. My question, if you think that Joe Biden will continue the Obama policy in the region, and if this policy will be favorable to the interests of the EU in the region. I recall that there was some wiretapping of some telephone conversations in which an American ambassador literally said, "Fuck the EU." So do you think that the election of Biden as president will affect the interests of the EU negatively in Ukraine, for instance?
I don't think so. I think it will make it slightly easier in a way, because of course the EU has been developing a more conflictual relationship with Russia, not by its own choosing, but it has happened over the last couple of years. And of course, the big difficulty that the EU had was that President Trump, on the whole, has been relatively supportive of Russia. He's been relatively supportive of Russia keeping its sphere of influence. We saw that when it came to a variety of different countries. We saw that certainly in Ukraine. We saw that in Georgia. We saw that in Nagorno-Karabakh, Armenia, Azerbaijan, where the US pretty much stayed out of it completely. So as a result of that, President-elect Biden is unlikely to go down that route. President Biden is more likely to be telling Russia, look, you can go so far, but we don't really believe in this idea that you have your sphere of influence where you can just do whatever you want. As a result of that, relations with Russia are likely to become more conflictual. But for Europe, what that means is that they're likely to be more supportive of European current state of affairs. Now, that doesn't mean that they are perfectly aligned. Of course, there's going to continue to be problems. The kind of gas pipeline from Russia to Germany is obviously going to be a problem with the new US administration also. But I think overall, interests are going to be more likely to be aligned with the EU than before. And certainly the European Union might become, to an extent, more confident in its dealings with Russia as a result of that. But I think one thing that is important to be pointed out is, of course, that we're going to possibly see a very big change in Russia in the next months. I mean, there have been a number of reports that maybe President Putin might step down over the next couple of months and so on. So that could be something that, new president in the US, new president in Russia, that could also maybe lead to better overall relations. I mean, if only for the first 2 years when everybody gets to know each other. But I think there's a possibility of something like that.
Please tell us more about that, because that's breaking news for us, that this idea that Putin will step down. Could you please elaborate on that?
Yes, I mean, at the moment, nothing has been confirmed by the Kremlin, but there have been a number of media reporting in certain media outlets on the internet that seem to suggest that Russian President Putin is very ill, that he might have pancreatic cancer, and as a result of that he might be willing to step down by January, which would actually then come in around the same time as President Biden might take office. Is this true? Well, I cannot verify this. I do not know whether this is true or not. I can only see what I've seen. And as a result of that, it is a possibility. I mean, if we look at the number of incidents that have happened in Russia over the last couple of years, where President Putin just disappeared for a number of weeks and so on, it is at least a credible story. That doesn't make it a true story, but it makes it a credible story. And we might then, it is also coupled with another legislative initiative in Russia that is undergoing legislative process right now, which is to give former presidents full criminal immunity from any crimes that may or may not have been committed during their presidency. If you remember, when President Yeltsin stepped down, one of the first acts of President Putin was to make sure that he's absolved, that he gets full criminal immunity for anything that may not have been legal. And in the same way, at the moment, the Russian Duma is undergoing legislative procedure to absolve any past and future Russian president from any criminal responsibility for crimes committed in office, which could be the precursor to President Putin resigning.
That's news to me. So, but still, I think we should leave that particular topic, which would be a very, very important one, for another discussion that we will hold in the Eurosci network channel. Finally, talking about security as well. Recently, Donald Trump has been criticized by Israel because I believe he sold F-35 airplanes to Emirates recently, and Israel was not in favor of that sale of military equipment, even though the relations now in the Middle East are improving. And Trump said that one of his great achievements during the campaign, he mentioned that he had improved relations, peaceful relations in the Middle East. What can you tell us about the Middle East, and in particular in relation to this new president of the US?
Yes, I mean, I'm not entirely sure that Trump was fully criticized by Israel on that sale, because from what I read, in fact, the sale of the fighter jets was part of the discussions between Israel and the United Arab Emirates in terms of normalizing the relationship. So it was, in fact, the Israeli government that approved those, and kind of, to an extent, you could even argue, lobbied with President Trump to approve those sale. So in that sense, I wouldn't say Israel as a whole really were so critical of that particular sale. I think the way it's also perceived in the Middle East, certainly by Israel, is that a strengthening of the United Arab Emirates means also weakening of Iran. And a weakening of Iran is, of course, in the interest of a number of different players in the Middle East, Israel, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, that would perceive this particular sale as a weakening of Iran. Now, with President-elect Biden, what we might find is an attempt, at least, whether it'll be successful is another question, but an attempt to maybe revive the Iran deal. Obviously, it is legally impossible to revive it in the exact format that it was done. Of course, Iran is now much closer to having a nuclear weapon than it was 4 years ago. So as a result of that, we will probably see attempts to rewrite the deal with Iran. And Iran has already made some noise that they would welcome a discussion with President Biden on the deal. And I think we will see some movement on that front. Now, this, if there is such a deal, if the deal is revised, would be seen as a threat by a number of countries in the Middle East, of course, notably Saudi Arabia, Israel, United Arab Emirates, possibly Egypt, that are going to perceive that as a threat to their own security. So if President Biden wants to revise that deal in such a way, then he will have to ensure actually that those countries feel safe, that they feel safe by whatever happens in Iran. So he will attempt that, but whether he will be successful with that is going to be the important question, because it's not going to be a very easy situation for him to revive that deal.
Okay, the final question comes from the public, from the audience. They have written now the question on the chat on YouTube, and the question is related to the current pandemic and to the US policy and the UK policy regarding this pandemic. Do you think that the policies of the US will change with the new administration towards the pandemic, how they deal with it? And do you think if it's a right policy or not so far, if it will improve? And also the question is about the UK policy in relation to the pandemic. So it's the topic in general. The question is about the policies to deal with the COVID pandemic, and if you think they will change, and do you think they will go in a better direction or not?
Yeah, I think the first thing to be said about the pandemic, the policy to deal with the pandemic, of course, in the US, is that the US is, of course, a federal state, which means that there is no uniform policy to deal with the pandemic across all states. What we've seen is that very often governors took charge of the pandemic and kind of introduced either lockdowns or opening or that sort of thing. And the US federal government doesn't really have the legal powers to force them necessarily to implement a policy that they don't want. However, what we also saw under US President Trump was a discouraging of, or even going a little bit further than discouraging, an actual threatening some governors to open up the economy. And that is certainly something that is going to change with President Biden. President Biden will be more encouraging to bring the virus under control. He's probably more likely to encourage governors to go down the lockdown route. But at the same time, we now have the big gift in terms of the vaccine. So I think this is going to significantly change the policy as well, because it will mean that a rollout of the vaccine in a very, very quick fashion would mean that maybe we don't have to talk about lockdowns in the near future anymore. So it's obviously not something that will happen overnight, but maybe by the summer, by the autumn, we might have a situation where we can be in a much, much better place than what we're now. So I think that is certainly going to help President Biden to get the situation under control. Now, if we look at the UK, I think we can say similar things. I mean, the first lockdown was, of course, a lockdown that was imposed by the UK government, and that was right across the UK. But what we're seeing with the second lockdown is a kind of a fracturing of the situation where we have different lockdowns. We have an English lockdown that is all over England, but we have, like Wales, where I live, for instance, has just come out of the lockdown, a circuit breaker lockdown. It was only 2 weeks. That was at a totally different time than the English lockdown, and with no plan to follow the English lockdown. Scotland, again, has a totally different schedule and lockdown, and Northern Ireland being completely different altogether again. So what we're seeing here is, to an extent, a very fracturing of the political situation, a kind of drifting apart of the different parts of UK in different directions in terms of pandemic. But I would imagine that this is going to become better now that the vaccine is actually has been developed. So now it's a question of kind of how far and how quickly can you roll out the vaccine. And I think this might bring us then much closer to the end of the pandemic, which will then, in a sense, alleviate the situation. It might also then, to an extent, stop the drifting apart of the different parts of the country. So I think, in that sense, it's very welcome news by everyone. But it might stop some of the negative developments that we've seen over the last couple of weeks or months.
We've got more questions from the audience now, because they like that you answered the question about the pandemic, and they've got now a new question for you, which is about Nord Stream 2 and the German and European dependency on Russian gas. And it was a policy. Well, the question is a question, but it's also a statement. It says that Trump was opposed to Nord Stream 2 and to, in general, to Europe's dependency on Russia and in Russian hegemony in Europe. They say that Trump was opposed to this. Do you think this will change with Biden? What will Biden do about Nord Stream 2?
Well, personally, I'm not entirely convinced that Trump was really opposed to that. Despite his rhetorical commitment to oppose it, I don't think he was actually opposed to it. I think he was quite happy to leave Russia a certain zone of influence. And there's been an accommodation between President Trump and President Putin, I think. He was pressurizing Germany with Nord Stream because, of course, it fit this larger picture in terms of pressurizing Germany. But I don't think it was necessarily because of an aversion of Russian influence. I don't think he was necessarily opposed to Russian influence in Europe. I think for Germany, the situation under President-elect Biden is going to become more uncomfortable in that sense with Nord Stream, because I do think President Biden is going to oppose this more vigorously than perhaps even than President Trump did. I think, but the tonal difference will make the difference, because what we've seen actually recently in Germany has been a shift away from Nord Stream within the political spectrum, especially within the Christian Democratic Party, where following the poisoning of Alexander Navalny, there's been a number of politicians that came out with statements that we should maybe reconsider Nord Stream. And I think in the next couple of months, we're going to see more and more movement in that direction. I think President-elect Biden is probably going to encourage that type of thinking. The difficulty, though, is what is the alternative? And I think that's where the problem is a little bit with the German political class, that there is a certain dependency, like you just pointed out, and I think that makes it difficult to stop those type of projects in the short term. And I think that's where a solution could come from, if there was a clear alternative being presented to the German political spectrum, to at the same time reduce German dependency on Russia, while at the same time also providing a clear energy alternative that will, in a sense, help German energy consumption. I think then there is a certain readiness within certain aspects of the German political spectrum, also amongst the Greens. There's been a number of politicians that have said we should really think about Nord Stream. And the likelihood of a CDU Green coalition after the next election might mean that we could find a solution come October, November of next year, when we might have a new government that will include the Christian Democrats and the Greens in Germany. And that might then put the Nord Stream project on hold.
And exclude the the SPD?
That is quite likely. If we go by current opinion polls, it is quite likely that we might have a Christian Democrat Green coalition after the next elections. Even former German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder described that in an interview very recently as a very likely scenario. Obviously not one that he wishes. It would also significantly reduce the influence of certain politicians, notably also Gerhard Schröder in the German political spectrum. But I think it is something that, looking at all the opinion polls as we can see them, is looking increasingly likely as a possibility for the next elections.
Okay, so we need to bring this discussion to a close, this broadcast on YouTube, public discussion that is offered by the Eurosci Network. The Eurosci Network is a network of academics and institutional organizations that support international cooperation through educational technology, going beyond traditional cooperation based on the physical mobility of students and teachers. This network is currently present in 24 academic institutions in 13 countries of Europe, South America, and Africa. And Professor Christian Kaunert is a prominent member of the Eurosci network, and we are all very proud and we're very thankful for his generosity of being with us here today. Now we will continue the discussion by Zoom with the students of Alexandru Ioan Cuza University in Iași, and Christian Kaunert will have the opportunity to say hello to them in a few moments. And this brings our transmission to a close on YouTube. Thank you very much, Professor Kaunert.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.